I am K Wu. It's short for Katherine Wu, but everyone calls me K Wu because there's always lots of Kates, Katies, Kathys around everywhere I go. So that's what I go by, K Wu, and I have been a Ruby developer at New Relic in Portland for the last 3 years. Oh, turn things on, that helps. Cool. So what I'm here to talk about is sort of coming from the perspective that before I was at New Relic, I had a whole bunch of different kinds of jobs. The closest job that I had that was sort of on the IT side of things was I actually worked at a Mac computer lab in college all 4 years that I was there. And just as a side note, in the 4 years I was there, mainly what I learned was if there was some problem, just restart the computer, and then it basically makes most things go away. So that's the extent of the knowledge that I have on that kind of Mac admin side. But I was also before I had this job at New Relic, I was also a product specialist at Google, where I did some product managery kinds of tasks, like feature prioritization with an engineering team. I also did several years of tech support. So what I'm saying is that I have a fair amount of experience in trying to persuade developers to work with me and build things for me. And so switching over into this new career as a developer directly, that has been a ton of fun. It's been really, really great experience. But it also often feels like I just have a ton that I need to do to catch up on. And maybe those of you that are more on the ops side and later coming to the dev side of things, maybe you might feel the same way too. And so a cool thing, though, that I've realized is that a lot of being a working developer actually has nothing to do with the coding bit. So this image is supposed to be a pie chart representing proportions of the work as a developer, but it's also just kind of a random visual joke. So if I click through this, we have Pac-Man, not Pac-Man, and then Pac-Man's eye here. I have a coworker at work he has a t-shirt of this, and it cracks me up every time. Anyway, so as technical people, I think if we're going to be perfectly honest with ourselves, fundamentally, we're definitely smart people, but we're also kind of lazy, right? Like, we want to automate tasks and find shortcuts and all of those sorts of things. And so, for me, I have been applying that laziness to porting over skills that I developed in my old jobs to my new one, where I'm doing more with the coding, even while I'm still learning about that coding side of things. And so I've got these 2 weird tricks for working well with other developers and with no code required in here. And they are really, first, to build better relationships, and the second is to get better at communicating. So of course, I'm mostly speaking from my own experience as a more junior developer with a non-traditional background, but hopefully even all of you folks that have more experience than me will find ways to apply similar concepts. So my 3-step foolproof plan for building better relationships, this thing that everyone's always talking about or whatnot, is really just getting to know people and making friends, because of course, friendship is magic. Yes, indeed. Oh, and whoever it was I talked to yesterday who knows Vanessa White, who's in the Mac admins Slack channel, I think I'm pretty active there as well. She used to work at New Relic. This actually was a photo that I took from the My Little Ponies that she had scattered around her desk back in the day when I first made this presentation. So there's some further connection there too. So anyway, I actually personally find this pretty hard because even though I'm standing up in here in front of you, I'm actually a pretty strong introvert. I missed out on some of the activities last night because I'm always hiding away the day before I actually have to give a talk. And I find that other developers and technical folks are, by and large, fairly introverted as well. So it can be hard to get conversations going at times. Luckily, at my last job, where I worked with product management and engineering, I came up with a few hacks. The first one of these is to get people to want to help you. And again, on the idea of getting to know people better, I swear, like getting better at making friends, I think that that's actually a skill that you can practice and improve at over time. Growing up, I always had this idea that there are people that are born with charisma, and then there are kind of the rest of us. But I think that, maybe that's still true a little bit. Natural inborn talent is sort of a thing, but it still means that, it doesn't mean that you can't get better at it still. One of the ways I do this is I try to really pay attention and remember small details that people have told me, especially about their lives outside of work. Because a lot of times it's even easier for me to remember these details than people's names, which honestly are kind of arbitrarily assigned at birth and don't necessarily have anything to do with your personality or how you look or other memorable details in some way, right? So remembering these details, like we had a conversation about bacon or whatever. Everyone who was at our lunch table yesterday, we were like, oh yeah, bacon, this is a topic that we can go on for a really long time about. And that makes for more memorable conversations, I think, than typical small talk. So once we've had this established base of a relationship in a way in these non-technical conversations, I think it's a lot more helpful for those technical conversations down the line. Another kind of dorky thing that I do is I actually somewhat mentally prepare stories to try to get conversation going of interesting or maybe unusual things that I've done lately. Because otherwise, when someone asks me something like, how was your weekend? My tendency by default is to just freeze up and say, like, oh, good, it was fine. And that's kind of it. Like, does anyone kind of react like that to small talk sorts of conversations? Yeah, and you're just sort of like, I don't know what to say. So sometimes I'm sitting there thinking like, okay, when someone asks me how my weekend was, I'm going to talk about, oh, I actually did something interesting. I took a pasta making class or something really fun like that. And it invites them to ask me more questions and share hobbies that they've done as well. Just from talking to folks yesterday, people here have all sorts of really cool and interesting things. I met someone yesterday who his main thing that he's really into is taking really long motorcycle trips in the desert by himself and other remote places, and that's really fascinating, I think. So another item then is to try to share common interests. For example, I run a couple continuing education programs at work in addition to my regular day job. And one of these is our technical book club, which we have had going for over a year and a half now. And right now we're working our way through this, through that Google Site Reliability engineering book that came out a couple months ago. This was a suggestion that actually came from our DevOps and site engineering folks, and it's been a really interesting read. It's very accessible. It's mostly a collection of essays in the end, with plenty of technical details about how Google does things and how you might be able to pattern your programs after that as well. And so even though I don't do ops stuff directly myself, I find it's still useful to learn about it, and we have a group of 20, 25 people that meet every week to discuss the few chapters we'd assigned the previous week. Another program I run at work is called LunchConf, which originated from this idea that I have a tendency to bookmark a lot of talks, but then not actually watch them. And then there's just all these tabs open in my browser. So it turns out that peer pressure is a really good way to get me to do things. And LunchConf is we book a conference room and bring our lunches together, watch these conference talks, and try to whittle down that list of never-ending bookmarks. It's been running for over a year, so that's like 50, 60 talks that I would have not watched otherwise. It's just another cool thing that we do together to have a shared perspective, even if we're working across different teams on a day-to-day basis. I have more details about both of these in a blog post and a separate talk that I've done on continuing education at work. So yeah, I just think it's cool to have these sorts of things so that you get to know each other before those situations where you're like, oh my God, everything is on fire. But hey, this is my buddy from book club. We can work this out. Finally, I think it's really good to try to show your appreciation when people are helping you, to encourage them to do more of that thing, right? When people have gone out of their way, I really like to make a note of doing things like telling their manager, because managers like to hear what their teams are up to. That's been really helpful to other teams, and it's just it's hard to know what everyone is working on in detail, I'm sure. So trying to share some of that positive appreciation goes a long way, I think. So this is where we are so far. We just finished part 1 of trying to build better relationships here. The second item then is to make your team look good to other teams. It helps your team feel good, and it makes other teams feel good too about working with your team. One of the ways in which we do this on my team is we try to give really awesome demos, or in just like sprint review sorts of meetings. You can give really awesome demos just by trying to be a bit more thoughtful and prepared. For example, think about why this change matters to your audience. Why should they care? Think about how you can show before and after with screenshots, collecting metrics, just to show why this thing that you did was a big deal and really cool. It's also a great way to get full credit for the team, even when the kind of work you're doing may not be immediately visible. If you explain it well, then people understand, oh, right, that's why these DevOps teams, like, they spent this time building up this infrastructure. It will help us with our stability down the line in these sorts of ways. You can also talk about corner cases in those situations that you either dealt with or consciously chose to delay for a time in the future. So again, it helps helps give off this impression of this team is really thoughtful, they'd considered certain needs, and they've explained their reasoning behind why we may want to get to that a little bit later rather than right now. So you don't have folks feeling disgruntled, like, oh, why didn't they think of that? Like, no, you did. And you had a reasoning behind your decision for later on. Sometimes I even go as far as to write a script for a particular demo, or just doing a couple practice runs. That way I can have a list of all the things that I might want to have open to start with and proceed through them in a way that builds up kind of a logical sense and drives everyone to the conclusion that I want them to have, which is our team is doing really awesome work and you should work with us more. Yeah, very not so complicated there. Status updates are another area, I think, where it's not actually that difficult to improve. So, I mean, yeah, they're pretty tedious. No one really likes doing this, not even project managers, I don't think. But even for these short updates, the thing that you can do is to read what you wrote and think, if someone else read this, and when they get to the end, would they still have this question, so what? So this is a tip that I got from one of my old bosses, and the idea is to make sure that your status update actually talks about the impact of what was done, rather than just a description of the work. So here's an example. We changed the email reports to be sent at 1 a.m. local time. So what? This is a thing that you did. So if we add in, this allows customers to receive data in their correct local time zone in an update to upper management or to other teams that might not be as directly involved in our work. That sounds pretty cool. So I like to think about this as kind of a translation into language that's more focused on, here's why you should care about what our team has been doing. Overall, it's really about trying to be responsive, thorough, and empathetic to the needs of other teams. I'm really proud of the time that someone on our support team at New Relic told me that I was her favorite engineer to work with because I was really responsive to the questions that they'd had. So all of this just helps people feel heard and knock down stereotypes about being unapproachable in some way. And so that way, when the time comes when your team needs their help, they'll be there for you too. So again, this is where we're at. Just finished part 1 and part 2. And now part 3, my favorite section of the talk actually, is this thing called ask versus guess cultures, which is my favorite frame for better understanding people and examining differences in communication styles. It is a culture clash that can cause a lot of tension if you're unaware about it. So let's go ahead and start with an example. So here's the situation. Let's say this is you. Oh, the contrast isn't great. Oh, sorry about that. But this is your friend, Jamie. And let's say Jamie has a friend named Taylor. This is someone that you've never met. And so Taylor is going to visit your city and needs a place to stay. But you'd rather not host a stranger. And so your friend asks you, can Taylor stay with you? What's your instinctual reaction in your head? Not out loud, just in your head. Is it, oh, no big deal, I'll just tell them no? Or is it something more like, oh, this kind of puts me in a difficult position? If you said the former, you're probably most likely from ask culture. And if you said the latter, then, and the situation would make you feel rather uncomfortable, you're most likely from guess culture. So show of hands, who identifies with the one on the left, ask culture? Oh, really? Okay, cool. And then guess culture, presumably? Okay, so maybe there's some folks that are a little bit unsure still. So I'll talk a little bit more about the differences between the two. So as far as I can tell, this ask versus guess culture description originated on an Ask Metafilter post in 2007. And the way it's described there is, in some families, you grew up with the expectation that it's okay to ask for anything because you're okay with getting no for an answer. So this is known as ask culture. In other families, on the other hand, you avoid asking unless you're pretty sure the answer is going to be yes. And the way that you determine that is you sort of put out delicate feelers to test out the waters. And if this is done really well, you won't even end up having to ask. You'll just get an offer of help from someone. And even in those cases, you might want to be a bit careful about accepting because you wouldn't want to impose on someone just because they were being polite. Fundamentally, guess culture is sort of around the idea that putting others in the position of having to say no seems a bit rude. So this is really a spectrum, not a dichotomy, even though I use the word versus at times when I talk about this. There isn't like a good or bad. It's not one culture is better than the other, and it can apply differently in different situations. It varies regionally and on a global scale as well. So, for example, we might put the US over here, where I'm from New Jersey, and Northeast, probably even further left on the ask culture side of things. But places that have a really strong reputation for being really nice tend to be more guess culture. So we might put Canada a little bit further over here. I've never met any mean Canadians. They're always super nice, to my face, anyway. If we take a look at some other countries, Japanese culture is somewhat infamously indirect in some ways, whereas all the Germans that I have ever worked with are extremely direct and to the point. I find it really great to work with them, so it suits me. A couple more concrete examples. This is one I read about something called the Seattle No. Shelly, you're from Seattle, right? Maybe you can tell me if this is actually a thing there. In Portland, I have definitely observed it a little bit. So it's not necessarily Seattle specific. I have also heard of this referred to as a California yes. And the way this goes is something like, oh, hey, I'm going to a party, do you want to come? And if the person says anything along the lines of, oh, yeah, that sounds interesting, I'll have to check, or, oh, yeah, maybe, and then you never hear from them again about it, this means no, apparently.
That is a thing.
Yeah, okay, cool, thank you for confirming. Yeah, this means no, and well, so my overall point is that the fact that that means no is not necessarily obvious to all of us. It's not to me, certainly. I have another example here, which happened in my home a few months ago. And so what the background is that normally on the weekend, my husband Dan and I each cook one big meal to have leftovers for the upcoming week. And so one day I was just like, oh, I don't think I have time to make lunch for next week. I was really just talking out loud about how I would need to figure something out to do for lunch to bring to work the next week. But my husband Dan, what he hears is, could you make extra meals so that I have lunch for the week? And so then he says, I'm going to cook 2 meals that weekend. And I'm sort of thinking like, oh, that's like, thinking of that as an independent statement. Like, that's kind of weird. Why does he want to cook 2 meals? But whatever, that's fine. Like, he's an adult. He can do that if you want. And I did not say, oh, you don't have to do that, which is what I should have said if I'd picked up the connection between those 2 previous statements. And so the end result at the end of the weekend is I'm over here thinking, why do we have so much food in the fridge? And he's over there thinking, I'm such a good husband. He really is, but I just miss those cues so often. So talk a little bit about the pros and cons in each. I certainly have a preference for one, if you can't tell already. I'm definitely very strongly on the ask culture side of things. And I'm sure my bias comes out at times, but it definitely does not mean it's objectively better overall. Ask a culture tends to prioritize efficiency in knowing exactly where you stand because there's no ambiguity, and you also tend to get what you want, at least in the short term. On the other hand, it can come across as a little bit more confrontational and can make people uncomfortable, maybe even alienate them at times. Guest culture, on the other hand, prioritizes avoiding hurt feelings or embarrassment from direct confrontations, and it is generally considered more polite, I feel. But because it depends on a really tight net of shared expectations, you have to be able to recognize those subtle signals that people are sending and receiving. So it's maybe not so great if you're like me and not so great at reading social cues at times. And if people don't share your expectations, you can end up feeling like no one is listening to you, perhaps. So I'll cover a couple strategies for handling. Really, it's just about trying to step a bit more into that other culture so that your message is clear and people are comfortable. And now that you can recognize the difference, you're most of the way there, I think. So if you're from ask culture, the number one tip I have is to make a guest culture close friend. Because this is what my husband Dan is for me. I'll bring home all sorts of interactions and explain them to him, and he'll help me see all those things that were said in between the lines. I'm hoping that over time I'm getting better at the second tactic, which is to try to listen more closely to what people are saying. Because again, just because they didn't say no doesn't mean that it's a yes. You're looking for a really enthusiastic yes instead. And finally, I mess up on this stuff all the time, so just go ahead and apologize later if you realize that what you said might have had multiple interpretations out there. If you're from guest culture, on the other hand, and it seems like most of this room is, well, anytime I practice this presentation for my husband, Dan, he's always just like, you don't need to do this part. Guest culture people already know what's up. They already understand all this. But I don't like the asymmetry from leaving this part blank. So I'll just cover a couple quick things, which is first that remember that people you're speaking to might be unaware of the rules, and it might take some education to bring them on board in one form or another. The other item is to try to resist the urge to soften a no, because I know the intention there is to avoid the hurt feelings from a direct confrontation, but if people don't understand and receive the signal that you're sending as a no, that can end up hurting folks as well. One phrasing that I like to use often is something like, oh, hey, I have a request, but it's totally cool if you want to say no, or it's totally cool if you're busy, or you have other stuff going on. It works on both sides as well, because if you're a guest culture person asking for help from someone else, you can use this to remind yourself that other people can say no to you if you give them the opportunity to do so. And hopefully that can help you feel a bit more comfortable about something you might have to ask. So this covers the first half by outline-wise of the talk of building better relationships by getting people to want to help you, making your team look good, and recognizing this ask versus guest culture difference. Now for better communication, I also have a 3-step plan here. The first of which is to make it easy for people to help you. Help them help you, right? So there are a few different ways that you can do this. The first one is to try to articulate why you're confused or trying to get more context in a way. I think one of the hardest parts to learning any new thing is letting people see inside your head. And it's easier for others to help you if you articulate your premises and the logic that you're using. So you can say things like, you had me up until such and such a point. Again, this idea of giving context. When, let's say, a development team is coming to you requesting something or other, you can turn back and try to get more context for them as well of what is it that you're trying to accomplish in the first place? And once you have that broader picture, I'm sure you'll have a wide variety of toolboxes, a wide toolbox of different things you can use to help them. Another phrasing is something like, I'm confused because I thought you said this and this, and then this and this, so it seems like this other thing would follow, and by verbalizing this train of thought, hopefully it can help you identify where did you diverge from in your mental model of what's going on here. This is a phrasing I like to use a lot when I'm asking for help on coding problems in particular, to describing, again, here's what I am trying to do and why. So if fundamentally the goal I have is a misguided one, someone can jump in right then and direct me in another direction. Yeah.
If you tell Costas this, it would be excellent.
What was that?
Just a gentleman in our community who he starts without telling anybody what he's trying.
Yeah. I mean, it's just describing your, so the other half is like describing your current problem and what you have tried already. 'Cause I don't know about you, it's kind of annoying to me when someone's like, oh yeah, I need to do this. And they're like, oh, did you try this? And they're like, oh yes. Did you try this? Oh yes. Did you try this? Oh yes. And I'm like, you could have just told me all of that up front, and then I could help you much more efficiently and quickly. And then we can go back to typing on computers and not have to talk to each other anymore, right? So another item here then is that remembering that having the courage to say, I don't know, is a strength, I feel. Because exposing your own ignorance will help you get to the solution that much faster. And if you're not worrying about protecting an ego of some kind, you can clear away those cobwebs and get to the answer that much sooner. So for me, I'm always practicing things like, again, especially when learning new coding things, saying things like, wait, I don't actually even know what that word means that you're using right now. I've been in meetings where my manager has looked over my shoulder and I'm Googling terms as people are talking about them in the meeting. Because I'm like, that's English. I know how to spell that word. I have no idea what you're saying to me right now. So this happens a fair amount. It's also good to try to really give specific and positive reinforcement. So if you think back to the last time that you asked someone for help, probably you might have heard something from them afterwards that was like, did that help? Did that help? And I think that's because a lot of us just really want validation that what we're doing has some kind of impact. So my favorite feedback from people is that they actually used my advice in some way. So, and if you tell people specifically what they did that helped you, they will hopefully do more of it. Again, further helping them help you. So I will just even use specific phrasing like, it really helped me when you ... fill in the blank. When you use that format of describing your problem, when you told me what you were trying to do in the first place so that we could get on board that much faster. So this is where we are overall. The second one then here is to ask good questions, because I really think that questions are basically like a superpower. And so it comes with great responsibility as well, right? They're invaluable for highlighting assumptions and helping the team avoid dead ends of one kind or another. And it helps everyone move that much faster to whatever goals you're trying to accomplish. Questions like, are we working on the right thing? Or is there a reason that we're doing it this way? Because either it could give you some more context and background for why we are in the direction that we're going, or it will reveal that actually we have a misunderstanding about some requirement that we're talking about. And maybe in my old job in those situations, this came up a lot, where we would somehow, somewhere, an offhand comment got misinterpreted as a must-have item. And revealing those mismatches can help scope things more appropriately. So of course, you want to ask your questions in a way that doesn't put people on the defensive. If someone hisses at you, that's probably not a good sign. But trying to express humility goes a long way here, because you're asking questions because you want to learn rather than assuming that you already know in some way. There are also all sorts of other questions you can think of that non-developers might come up with as well, like your users, your salespeople, upper management, anyone from those things. And everyone is perfectly qualified and credentialed for thinking of those sorts of things. Getting these answers ahead of time will give your team a jump start in looping in other teams as needed. And so that if you know that if the only answers you currently have are kind of vague, that's an opportunity to dig further for more clarity and to be prepared. So to go into this last arena then, this one is about giving good feedback. So on that other side from asking questions, providing constructive feedback is really important too, I feel. Giving useful feedback in the right venue at the right time, that's hard for a lot of people. And so when I was in tech support, we did quality reviews of each other's work every few quarters, and we did peer feedback as well. So based on that, a practice at phrasing feedback while still keeping friends, one of the things I learned was to spend some time thinking about what would be useful to the person receiving feedback before I tried to offer up any. What is it that they want? What are they trying to do again? Because you always get bonus points for bringing suggestions of potential solutions with you. It is hard sometimes to avoid nitpicking for having the sake of having something to say, but you want people to think that you have a really high personal ratio of useful to not useful things to say, so that when you do have something to bring up, they'll be that much more likely to pay close attention to it. Particularly when it comes to positive feedback. Something, again, I've been working on these last few years to make sure that when something good happens, to bring it up to folks. I recently heard that kind of in terms of positive versus negative feedback, aim for a minimum ratio of something like 3-to-1, sometimes even up to 10-to-1 instead, because in those cases, when I do have negative feedback to bring up, I'll be taken a lot more seriously rather than just being considered the crank in the office, which I have definitely done before as well. Sometimes giving good feedback, too, can also be just stating, I don't have an opinion on this topic, and withdrawing yourself from the pool of people that are weighing in. And it just makes life a lot easier for whoever's in charge of getting the group to a consensus, because you don't have to participate in that situation any further. One last part on feedback is to try to accept it graciously as well, so that you keep getting it and you can improve yourself. Try doing things like rephrasing what that person said to you to show that you understand the core part of their feedback. Don't get defensive, even if you may disagree with them, because you don't have to act on every piece of feedback. You just have to acknowledge it and make people feel heard. So this wraps up the second half of some of my ideas on better communication. I do have a couple more things to say about some pitfalls to avoid, because sometimes I think we have an issue in the tech community of undervaluing non-technical skills at times. And a lot of what I've talked about today is essentially using these non-technical skills to help yourselves move forward in whatever you're learning or working on with your team. And so, the thing is, you don't want to be assumed to be the secretary or whatnot, which is, I do not mean this as a diss on secretaries or anything. It's just not the goal that I'm working towards at this time. In particular, there's a phenomenon called the Girl Scout tax. There's a Wall Street Journal article about this from a few years ago that gave it this name, I think. And what it is that we often have a stereotype and expectation that women are helpful. And so unfortunately, this leads to women not always getting credit for providing that help, because supposedly that's just what women do. They're helpful, whereas a man who may have done the same task would be like, oh, he totally went out of his way, such a team player, above and beyond. Okay, I feel like you know what I'm talking about here. Yeah. So, this is just kind of one of those unconscious things that happens from time to time. I don't think it's intentional by any means for the most part, and it's just something to watch out for, I think. overall, really just keep focused on whatever your end goal is, whether that's getting better at coding, working on bigger features, or learning about the market and industry, whatever it is that you are aiming yourself towards, so that you can consciously choose the things you'll do that will bring you closer to that goal and not do the things that will move you farther away from it. So here are some recommended resources that I have for further reading. The first three here are a couple books that I have found really helpful as I got more into coding in general, and the others are blog posts. I have a scheduled tweet going out with a link to these slides, and I put them in the Dropbox as well, so you should be able to access them later. So with that, I would just say, as always, New Relic is hiring. These is a very short sample of the job titles that were on the jobs page when I looked at it last night. I couldn't fit any more. And I also have a whole bunch of New Relic stickers later if you want any. Thank you very much. I think I have time for questions.
Questions?
Just a compliment. That was a really good talk.
Yeah.
Thank you. Oh.
Jeff? Thank you.
It's really hard to tell sometimes because those of you who've given talks in front of technical audiences, you might find that people aren't always that emotionally expressive facially. So I was kind of like, okay, maybe you're all fighting fires, servers are melting down across the continent. I don't know. So thank you. I appreciate that. I was telling someone this morning, I always feel like I'm going to puke before I give a talk. But so far has not actually happened. Shelley?
So we heard about this. Oh, sorry. I should have known better, right? I should know better. I was wrong. So we heard about the Seattle no. Yeah. Can you explain the California yes?
Yeah, just I gave this talk at my company offsite actually a couple years ago, or that section of it, and New Relic, the engineering headquarters are in Portland, but the company headquarters are in San Francisco. So there are a fair number of people from that office there. Lots of transplants in San Francisco as well, and people were just saying yeah, this happens all the time in the Bay Area, where people just don't show up to things, I guess. Yeah. I think there's a question in the back. Oh, yeah. Oh.
Just a question about changing or rotating the team role. You're talking about the Girl Scout tax and or Girl Scout cookie tax. A lot of my clients are not in the technical world, and so we're often mediating the talks between the clients. But one of the frustrations we have is that it's hard to move that chair, who's mediating these or facilitating better communication. Any tips on how to pass that chair along to people who aren't there yet but should be there?
Yeah. It is really hard, isn't it? Because in general, a lot of these sorts of things, when I think about them, you can't really change other people a lot of the times, right? Only what is within your own actions are really all that's kind of under your own control. So I think for a lot of those situations, whenever we worked with customers, when I was on tech support, I had this one client who was perfectly nice in person, but he was just a complete jerk over email constantly. I have no idea why. He was really bad at writing or something. And in those situations, it was always basically sort of the most you can do is to try to lead by example in a way. In a lot of these groups I run at work, book club, lunch conf, a couple other things, when we're facilitating those meetings, I do like to just discuss up front, lay down some ground rules. From the perspective, not, if you do it up front, it's not so obvious that it's in response to oh yeah, that person over there is kind of a jerk sometimes. You're just hey, before we even get into it, let's just make sure we're all on the same page. This is how we conduct discussions and meetings here. This is how we trade off. I'm making sure everyone gets a chance to speak and feel heard in some way. And discussing that before any conflict comes up, I have found it has been really helpful to me. And then following up that conversation, once you have that initial one, I think it's easier later on to sort of say oh, hey, remember when we established that like that kind of comment is off limits in some way, or there's a boundary, just reinforcing and reminding people, sometimes one-on-one, that we want to work better together in some particular way.
So, Katherine, can you tell me a little bit more about the Technical Book Club? And is it physical books or ebooks?
Yeah, great question. I started this book club because there was one book in particular that I wanted to read. And again, I learned about myself that the strategy to get myself to do something is to talk other people into doing it with me. And then somehow that's extremely motivating because, so book club is every week, Monday at 4 o'clock. And turns out Monday, 3 to 4 p.m., I do a ton of reading and getting that in. Most of us, I usually do a bulk order of physical books because, I don't know, I find it easier for me anyway to get through. Some people do the ebooks as well, and then we all expense them. I went to my director once because we were buying a computer science-y textbook, and it was like, I don't know, $7 a book or whatever. And so we were spending like $1,000 on these books for book club for the group. And I just wasn't sure, like, oh, it's like kind of a lot of money. It's my director, and she was like, Wu, it's okay, please spend $1,000 on technical books because I just spent $1,000 this morning buying donuts. So it's great that you're doing this. I have all sorts of other ideas. I'd love to chat later, more kind of specific details about how I run those because I've thought about it a lot. The TLDR is essentially you only need 2 people to actually have a discussion. And so in general, the thing I like to do is to just like set a low minimum bar as much as possible. Sometimes people get too complicated in setting these sorts of things up. They get very excited. I'm like, okay, all we need is like 2 people. We meet at the same time. I hate having to reschedule things. And so if that happens, then, and we read more than we would have on their own, that was already a success. But yeah, I have more details about like the different kinds of books that we've covered, which ones were good ones and which ones could be skipped. Yeah, happy to chat more later.
Awesome. Everybody, thank you.